Hello, everybody. My name is Miss Amber. I am one of the English curriculum guides, and we are here with a reading selection review for today. If you've clicked on this video by accident, this is basically a type of lesson where we go over the reading selection from one of the tutorials in one of the English classes to try to make it easier to understand and easier for everyone to read. So uh, hopefully you got this link by checking out the resources in one of your English classes or your mentor or advocate sent it to you. Either way, today we're covering Rip Van Winkle from the first lesson of Unit 2 in English 11A. That is what we're covering today. So without further ado, we're actually just going to dive right in. I'm going to open up my screen so that you can see the beginning of the lesson. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen any of these lessons before, usually what we do is we'll stop by a couple of these slides early on in the lesson first, just to get you guys summaries on things you need to understand the reading selection. And then we're going to go through it. I'll try to break it down for you. And then after that, we'll take a look at the analysis and make sure that everything lines up and that you understand what happened in the story. Now, this is a process that can sometimes take a long time, so feel free to pause here, grab a snack, get some water, and just sort of be ready to, there won't be too many notes to take, but be ready to take notes if you need to about summaries and details about the story. Now, we're going to start off on slide 5. Now, we're not going through the whole tutorial. This is about the reading selection, but I did want to go over just some basic things about this lesson that will help you understand the reading selection. Now, of course, whenever you have an English class, they give you background on the time period that the things were written in so that you understand like what would have influenced things that are written at that time. Like imagine the sort of things that people write now, like blogs, video scripts and stuff like that. We do that because, like YouTube, TikTok, other streaming platforms, Twitch, all of these things are popular right now, right? So that's how people make their art. If you're from some time in like the 90s, you wouldn't understand why people find this stuff to be so important. So you would need an explanation of like what the culture is like at the time, right? What's popular, what people are doing, because that's what decides how people write things or how people make things. So the English classes do the same thing, just for older time periods than now. So the important parts of slide 5 is it tells you the time period that the Romantic movement took place. It was in the 1700s, and what it is made up of. They also give you reasoning about like why it came about. Basically, the previous writing age, like think of it as trends, right? The previous writing trend was to be very cold, logical, and factual. So the people who came up in the era afterwards basically felt like there was no creative life in what people were reading and writing back then. So people wanted to see like more emotion. The previous era was a lot about just sort of making sure that people could prove what was good for society. And the Romantic era was like, well, what about what's good for me as a person? What if I have different needs or different wants or different dreams outside of what society wants me to have? So a lot of the Romantic writings focus on the individual. So they focus on the emotions of one person instead of like a whole nation or a whole city or a whole country. Um, and they pretty much also focus on nature and just there's more creativity, imagination, and those sort of things. And it says here they rebelled against what they thought was constrained thinking. They celebrated emotion, clarity, mystery, and the grandeur of nature. And then on slide 6, we get more specifics about the types of writing, what went into it. We just talked about this, the importance of the individual over society. So that means that the writing pieces only feature one person and just that one person's thoughts. So there's no like really big, oh, people in this town, in this city, in this country should do this for the good of the nation, for the good of our principles and our morals. Instead, the writings were more like, what does this one person think while they're staring outside, looking at the forest across the lane from their home? What is this person in their home thinking about in intimate moments where they're just by themselves, right? They give you an example here, and I'm not going to read it out, but the name of the poem is My Books. And it's basically one guy giving you his thoughts while he stares at books on his shelf. And it's his thoughts and feelings, how he relates to the books he's looking at, how he feels about his home, the experience he's had while reading the books. You get his emotions about this one thing. So this focus is just on one person and not like a whole society of people. And it basically emphasizes, it's trying to drive home that it's important to be in tune with yourself and how you feel about things, not only consider what's good for everyone. And they give you a little more information too. The speaker of the poem, so that's like the voice of the person in the poem, they comment on the books in their study, right? But the focus is on the memories that those books bring to mind instead of the importance of the books themselves. So his thoughts and feelings are about the memories he has with the books. It's not about just writing about what the books physically look like, right? They're not giving you facts about the books. They're giving you his feelings about the books. And then on slide 7, they give you more detail on the focus on nature. But we kind of went over that already. What's important on this slide is they give you the summary of what you can expect from romantic stories and writing. So it's the focus on the individual, so the focus on one person and their feelings, and appreciation for nature. Those are the biggest qualities. There's also just sort of like the creativity that comes from not just describing everything as cold, hard facts. So, for example, with the book poem, you could describe what the books look like, how big they are, how many pages they are, how thick they are, what they smell like. But the poem wasn't about that. It was about his memories reading the books. And that's more of an emotional thing. So that's what they mean when they say focus on the individual. The book poem was just this one man's thoughts about his books that doesn't really touch on nature. The nature part is pretty much from other writing during this period. There are a lot of people who, instead of like sitting and talking about their memories with books, they would talk about their memories, spending time outside, even just their deep thoughts about what nature is and how beautiful it is and how scary it is. All righty. So now we're going to skip over to slide 14. We're almost at the reading selection. So slide 14 gives you information about the writer of Rip Van Winkle. They tell you pretty much his name, Washington Irving. He was a lawyer before he became a writer. They tell you about some of the stuff that he published, and that his first book was so successful that he could actually quit his job as a lawyer so that he could write full time. And then they also tell you about some other things that he read in that second paragraph there. But the most important thing is that it says his letters captured typical American lives and viewpoints during the early 1800s. So it's important for you to know that his writing style focuses on what the everyday person thinks and feels. You know, sometimes when we watch movies or TV shows, we have a lot of like really big ideas. We're talking about like heroes and villains. We're talking about people who like hold the world in their hands. They have to make really big decisions about things that are like bigger than them. But there are some people who don't write stories like that, and the stories that they write instead are about the everyday person. So like the person you pass on the street, your coworker that you never talk to. What do real people think and feel about the things that are happening around them? Or what would a normal person, a normal everyday person that doesn't have any weird funky powers, that doesn't have like jacked muscles or isn't in the best condition, like your everyday average Joe, what would they do if something if something in the story happened to them? That's kind of how he writes. And that's how he tried to write Rip Van Winkle. I have to tell you this in advance because I know this is an older piece and it's going to be really hard for you guys to sort of like lock on and imagine a person doing the things that people do in this story. But life was very different in like the early 1800s, right? So everyday person is a bit different than what we would think of now. So try to remember that Washington Irving does tend to write believable characters. They are believable for the time period that they were written in. And let's see. With all of that, we're very close. So we're on slide 15. You can see the reading selection here, but I want to take a moment to talk about vocabulary words. So this slide, all about vocabulary, right? So learning new words, learning how to use them. It's really tough when you are in a digital classroom because what you want to do is get through the lessons as quickly as possible. But you can't really learn words without coming across them over and over. There are different ways to do this. What they suggest here, and this is what I suggest, the same thing that's on this slide, look up words whenever you don't know what they are. While we're reading through this reading selection, I am going to stop and look up words. But if I skip over a word that you don't know, pause the video, go look it up. I have students ask me all the time whenever we have help sessions, is it cheating to do that? It is not cheating to look up words that you don't know. The thing is, you can only learn words if you're exposed to them all the time, if you're always looking at them. If you're a hands-on person, get like a deck of index cards from like the dollar store, write the words that you don't know on them, turn them over, put the definition on the back, and just kind of like flip through them over and over until your brain can start to predict what's going to be on the back of the card. That's a really good way to learn new words. If you have a hard time with doing it the hands-on way, just look it up every time you see a word you don't know. The fact that you have to stop and go look it up will create kind of like a memory in your brain. If you end up doing it enough times, your brain will notice that it's a pattern that you have to keep looking up this word, and it'll help kind of like bridge the gap by making it so that you don't have to stop everything to do that anymore. You have to train your brain, right, to learn new things. So stop the video, even if you're not watching this video and you're just studying on your own, whenever you see a word that you don't know, stop, look it up. It does actually help. I'm saying all of this to say we are going to stop and look up words while I'm going through here. If I look up words that you know, just wait for me to finish getting through it. It'll be fine. Lots of different students open these videos and they all know different levels of different words. So if there's a word here that you already know and you didn't need to stop for, that doesn't mean someone else didn't need to stop to look it up. So keep that in mind. Alrighty. Here we go. Rip Van Winkle. We've got the title at the top is adapted from Rip Van Winkle. They took the words and put them over here for you guys to read. And then they give you the author, Washington Irving, and his lifespan here. Now, the way that we're going to go through this is we are going to read every few sentences. I'm going to try to make sure that you understand exactly what's happening in each paragraph. And we're just going to go through it as best as we can. I'm going to stop and look up words that I think are especially hard. Some things that are like references, I might just explain. Okay, without further ado, this is Rip Van Winkle. It starts with, whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. So he's saying there's no way you can make your way up the Hudson. So things that you go up, rivers usually. You can go up a river or down a river. So the fact that Hudson is capitalized tells you that's the name of the river. Voyage is just a fancy word for trip or journey. And Catskill is also capitalized. It's the name of these mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. So this sentence, dismembered, means to cut apart. So they're basically saying that this set of mountains, the Catskill Mountains, is next to and almost a part of the Appalachian mountains. And then they tell you where they are. It's west of the river. So if you're looking going north, then that would be to your left. And then it says they swell up. Swelling means to get bigger. A noble height. Noble is like royal, regal. It's respectable. It's a high title. So basically, noble height means that they are on the higher side of mountains. And then lording the height that they have over the surrounding country. So basically, you can see the mountains from wherever you are in that countryside. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed, every hour of the day produces some magical hues and shapes of these mountains. Some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains. And they are regarded by all the good wives far and near as perfect barometers. So basically, because of where the mountains are, every time there's a change in weather and what the sky looks like, what time it is, the mountains are different. There's always something new to see with these mountains, which sounds like very lovely and breathtaking. And it says that they are regarded by all the good wives far and near as perfect barometers. So good wife usually just means the head of the household. This was just like old vocabulary. Good wives or goodies, they used to be called goodies, Goodys. So a goody is the head of household. So usually it's the mother of the children. Sometimes it'll be the grandmother, depending on the living situation. And then the barometers, if we were to look up barometers, we're going to do that here. Barometers, yep, definition there. So it says an instrument measuring atmospheric pressure used especially in forecasting the weather and determining altitude. So altitude is the operating word here. Altitude is how high something is. So basically, the weather pressure changes based on how high above the ground you are or how low below the ground you are. Usually there's less pressure the higher you go. So up on a mountain, there's not a lot of pressure at all, and that causes trouble with breathing. And then below the water, the pressure is higher, and usually that means that your lungs might get crushed. So being too high or too low, neither one is good. So a barometer is just the tool that you use. You can see the pictures over here. These are the tools that you use to see what the pressure is like. So basically, the colors and shapes of the mountains can help people tell what the weather is like on them. And then this next sentence gives you a description of that. It says, when the weather is fair and settled, they, and by they mean the mountains, they are clothed in blue and purple and print their bold outlines on the clear evening sky. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of gray vapors like vaporized water, almost like evaporating water, about their summits, which in the last rays of the setting sun will glow and light up like a crown of glory. So these are like really big descriptions of what the mountains look like at different times. When the weather's good, they're clothed. That means that they're like covered in blue and purple. And they might be talking about, like just what the sky looks like in the evening, because it says on the clear evening sky, right? And then it talks about what they look like when there are no clouds. They gather a hood of gray. So when it's too hot or too cold, you tend to get vapors in the air. Vapors is just, think of it like mist, basically. And it says it gets these vapors on their summits, so it's misty around the summits. And those can glow when the sun is setting. So far we just have a description of the mountains that everyone would recognize if they've ever been on this trip up the river. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the voyager, so that's the person traveling, right? So if a voyage is a trip, then a voyager is the person going on the trip. They may have described the light smoke curling up from a village. So descried is just a fancier word to like observe, notice, see. So there's light smoke curling up from a village, and you can see this village, or at least see the smoke coming up from the village at the foot of the mountain. So that's like the bottom of the mountain, right? Your feet are at the bottom of your body. So the foot of a mountain, the bottom of the mountain. Whose shingle roofs gleam among the trees, where just the blue tints of the upland melts away into the fresh green of the nearer landscape. So they're telling you where the village is settled. You can see their roofs. So obviously this village is near where trees are. And it says blue tints of the upland, right? So pretty much the areas where you can still kind of see the sky reflected from between the mountains. It is a little village of great antiquity. Antiquity is a type of word I will look up. It basically just means something that's very old, but we're going to look it up anyway, just to make sure. Yep, so antiquity is the ancient past, especially in the period before the Middle Ages. So they're just saying it has an old, classic sort of look. So it's a village of great antiquity. So it's been there for a while, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in the early times of the province, just about the beginning of the government of the good Peter Stuyvesant. May he rest in peace. So obviously the person who wrote this thinks highly of this person. And there were some of the houses of the original settlers standing within a few years, built of small yellow bricks, brought from Holland, having latticed windows and a gable front surmounted with weathercocks. So there's a lot of information here. They basically describe the general look of the village. They tell you what time it comes from, the time of Dutch colonists. They tell you about this man named Peter Stuyvesant, which is the beginning of the government in this area. He was a part of that. And you don't have to know exactly who he is to just know that apparently he's a historical figure that's important. And then it says that there were some houses of the original settlers standing within a few years. So they describe what the oldest homes look like, what they looked like when they were built. Small yellow bricks that were brought from Holland, and Holland is a country. And then it says having latticed, or it's Holland is it's a city in it's a city in the Dutch country, basically. So having latticed windows and a gable front surmounted with weathercocks. So weathercocks are like weather vanes. That's what the original names of them were. And the gable front just means that they have gates. They have gates. So this is like a very kind of like old-timey traditional community. In that same village, and in one of these very houses, which to tell the precise truth was sadly time-worn and weather-beaten. So weather-beaten means that, you know, it's eroded their issues with how it looks. It looks old and beat up by the weather. Lived there many years since while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. So now we have our character, our main character, right? He's the person that this story was named after. And he's in this village and in one of those houses. So that part's very simple. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles, who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous rays of Peter Stuyvesant, I think it is, Stuyvesant, and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. So they're giving you information about his background, his people. So he's descended from people who were around during the days when this city was or village was founded. And it says they accompanied him to a siege. If you don't know what a siege is a type of battle where you basically wait outside where your opponent lives and you try to starve them out. So like cities usually have to get food and water from places that are around them. But if you're sitting outside with weapons so that nobody can get in or out, you basically are starving people out into giving up, right? So that's basically what a siege is. All right. It says he inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. So they're telling you right now, he came from great people that went off to battle with this really great guy. But Rip Van Winkle inherited, it says, but little of the martial character. So martial usually just means like very disciplined. It refers to like the disciplined behavior of people in the military. So if you have martial character, it usually means that you're trustworthy, you're brave, you're organized, because those are all the things that soldiers have to be. But it says he inherited little of that. So they're telling you he's not like that. He came from good people, but it didn't pass down to him, is pretty much what this is saying. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient husband. Indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity. So he is a kind person. Like, you don't have to necessarily be, militant or like a soldier to be kind. He's a good-natured man. He's a kind neighbor. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's brave. So it says, for those men are apt, uh, oh, let's back up a second. Indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity. So a meek person is usually somebody who's humble, right? And then it says the latter circumstance, so him being an obedient husband. And they're saying that he's probably an obedient husband because he's so humble. And that spirit is what's made him popular with everyone. So universal means everybody. Something that's universal means it applies to everyone. So he's popular because he's a meek, humble kind of guy. And then it says, for those men are apt to be obsequious. And we're going to look that up because I feel like that's a little more difficult than usual. So we have obsequious and conciliating. So we're going to look up obsequious first, obsequious. So we're gonna, let's put that in there. Definition. All right. So obsequious, obedient or attentive to an excessive or servile degree, right? So basically, you're a little too humble. You're a people pleaser, pretty much is what this is. And conciliating, I can make a guess at what this means because I know the word reconciliation, right? And this shares that section. So reconciliate, right? The only thing that's different is the ing. So if you're reconciling with someone, it means that you're easy to make things up with, right? You're easy to forgive. So that's the context clues for that word. And we're going to look it up and see if it actually means something that's close to that. So here we go. Conciliating. Yes, it says to stop someone from being angry or discontented, right? So yeah, to placate or pacify. That means that you're good at smoothing things over. You're good at de-escalating a situation, right? So they're describing him as someone who's meek. He's actually a people pleaser. And he basically doesn't like conflict, pretty much is what they're describing. And that's why they said that he inherited but little of the martial character of his ancestors. So if you don't like conflict, you wouldn't be running off to a siege, right? So even though he's nice, he doesn't like stand up for himself, right? So yes, for those men are apt to be obsequious, right? So that's like people pleasing. You're always trying to smooth things over, right? And conciliating. So they're both very similar words. Abroad. So that means everywhere you go. For those men are apt to be like this abroad who are under discipline at home. So basically they're saying if you're like this at home, if you're letting people at home walk all over you and tell you what to do, you're probably going to also be a people pleaser. Um, when you're out and about. And then it says that their tempers, doubtless, doubtless means that you don't have any doubt that this is happening. You have no objections. You think it's possible. So their tempers, doubtless, are rendered pliant. Pliant is something that's flexible or bendable, and malleable. And malleable is moldable. So like think of like clay. So pliant and malleable is what clay is. So their tempers are basically like clay in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation. So basically, they're saying he's so soft that whenever there's a fight at home, he folds immediately. That's what they're saying here. He's just a very meek guy, and that it's very likely that his family walks all over him at home. And a curtain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long suffering. We have a termagant wife. Now, termagant, and I mean, we're kind of getting hints at what he's like, right? Like if he's kind of been like beaten into submission at home, then having a termagant wife is probably having a spouse who's like angry, disgruntled. But we're just gonna make sure by looking it up. Context clues are great, but you always want to make sure. So yeah, it says a harsh-tempered or overbearing woman. So this is a word that is specifically applied to women, which is not surprising at the time that this was written. So it says a termagant wife may therefore in some respects be considered a tolerable blessing. And if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. So what they're saying here is because he's so soft that he'll fold at the first mention of conflict, right? He's always the person apologizing, making things up, right? He doesn't want anybody to be upset with him because he can't deal with that. It basically is saying that since he's been taught to be this way by his family, it could be considered a blessing that his wife is the sort of person to just be that way with him. So basically, they're describing that his wife is well suited to him because this is the personality that he has. He has a wife that he could just do everything for and not argue with because he's willing to always apologize. And even though some other people might not like that, it says he might be thrice blessed indeed. So basically, his wife isn't just like an overbearing person. She's that times three. He's dealing with it in the extreme. So this is the description of who he is in the village and what type of person he is. Certain it is when he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual, took his part in all family squabbles and never failed. Whenever they talked those matter over in their evening gossiping, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. And basically, what they're saying is everyone likes him. So regardless of what his wife is actually like, everyone blames his wife anyway. Certain it is he was a great favorite. So we know good wives are head of the households, and he's popular among them because he basically is a people pleaser, right? And it says that they took his part in all family squabbles. So basically, they always take his side no matter what is happening. And pretty much they don't really they don't really explain if his wife is actually mean or if everyone thinks that she's mean just because they like Rip Van Winkle more. But they leave it up to your imagination to figure it out. What they do tell you, though, is that they always take his side. The women of the village always take his side. And whenever there's an issue, they always blame it on his wife. They blame it on her when they gossip because they like him so much. And then it says the children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity. Impunity is a word that we would look up, But the rest of that was pretty understandable. They pretty much said he's always surrounded by the kids of the village and the women of the village because everybody loves him. So they're playing tricks. The kids are playing tricks on him with impunity. So impunity means exemption from punishment or freedom from the consequences of an action. So they're able to play tricks on him without getting in trouble because he's just that playful of a guy. And it says, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. So they're basically just saying, man, he's such a great guy. Everyone loves him. They love him so much that they assume his wife is awful. Because everybody loves him so much. And whenever they have a dispute, nothing's ever his fault. That's pretty much what they're saying here. The great error on Rip's composition. So composition is how a person is made up. So an error is a mistake. So they're basically saying his only flaw, right? Was an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. So insuperable, we can kind of guess. So aversion means to avoid. Aversion is like just the elevated word for avoid. So insuperable is going to be a word that's related to emphasizing that. So insuperable here says impossible to overcome. So he can't get rid of that aversion. He can't stop avoiding work. Profitable means you can make money off of it, right? So if he has an insuperable aversion, that means that there's no way that he can get rid of avoiding profitable labor. It says here, it could not be of want for assiduity or perseverance. Now, most people have heard of perseverance is when you are willing to push at something until you get through it or you achieve it. So we're going to look up assiduity just to make sure we have that definition. So assiduity says constant or close attention to what is doing, of what one is doing. So basically, assiduity is paying close attention, having focus. So it says it could not be for want of like that focus, right? Or perseverance. So like persistence pushing through. So basically, the issue isn't that he can't focus on anything or he doesn't have the attitude to do anything. It's not about what he can do. For he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and as heavy as Tartar's lance and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble. So Tartar is like a historical, Tartar's lance is a rhetorical, a historical reference. So just know it's a famous lance. And they're just saying that obviously he can focus and he can be persistent because he'll sit near a lake and fish all day even without getting a bite. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours together, trudging through the woods and swamps, and uphill and down dale. Dale is like kind of like a type of landscape to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. So a fowling piece is a type of gun, obviously. And it says that he'll trudge through. Trudging means like to drag and stomp your way through woods and swamps to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. So basically what they're describing here is there's stuff for him that he's willing to do. He has the patience and he has the focus to do something for long periods of time. But he just doesn't want to do work for money. And they give you more examples. He would never refuse to assist a neighbor even in the roughest toil. So if a neighbor needed help doing work, he would work with his neighbor. It was foremost a man in all country frolics for husking corn. So frolics, it's just like a way to be playful. So basically they're saying that he's even good at things that people do for leisure, like husking corn, building stone fences. The women of the village too used to employ him to run their errands and to do such little odd jobs as their less obliging husbands would not do for them. So basically everyone's got him running around being a gopher. So the issue isn't that he can't work. He's working all the time. He's just not doing it for money, right? In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business but his own, exactly. But as to doing the family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. So he'll do work for anybody else. His own work, he can't do. In fact, he declared it was no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. So he says declared is just to say something with like finality, with certainty. And then pestilent, we can look it up, but pestilent basically just has to do with something that is pestering, something that is not going to grow very well. So if you've seen like pestilence mentioned in the Bible, it basically just means that it's not good ground to it's not good ground to grow things on. Let's see. We'll go to Merriam-Webster since it didn't pop up this time. But pestilent is capable of being passed down by physical contact from one person to another. So in this case, with like a field, pestilent basically just means like ineffective, right? So it says infectious and ineffective, or I'm sorry, infective. And then pretty much, yeah, okay. Pretty much what they're saying here is and I don't think actually, let me look one more time. Whoops. I want to make sure that I got this right. Yeah. So usually, let's see, annoying, lethal, I think. Yeah, so pestilent is what they mean here, this third definition. I'm sorry. Likely or likely to cause or capable of causing death. In this case, it's like the death of a like farm. Annoying will work too. It can also just be annoying, right? So he has a very annoying farm that isn't going to actually grow the way it's supposed to or be run easily. It says everything about it went wrong in spite of him. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cow would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow quicker in his fields than anywhere else, and the rain always made a point of setting in just as he had some outdoor work to do. So that though his patrimonial estate, patrimonial means passed down from your father or belonging to the father of a group. So though his patrimonial estate had dwindled away under his management, acre by acre, until there was little more left than a mere patch of corn and potatoes, yet it was the worst conditioned farm in the neighborhood. So usually if you have a small farm, it's easy for you to run it because there's not as much land to manage, right? That's basically what everyone is saying here. And so because this is supposed to be an easy patch of farm to run, it's really sad that he still can't get it to work the way it's supposed to. So he can do work for everyone else, but not his own farm, and he feels like it's useless to work there because he just has bad luck. Fate is against him. Now it says Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-oiled dispositions. So well-oiled just means like well cultivated or taken care of, right? Because if you oil something regularly, anything that needs to be oiled, that means you're paying attention to it, you're caring for it, right? So well-oiled just means that he runs smoothly. He has a very smooth, happy, kind of like well-working, easy-going personality, right? Because when you oil things, they slip against each other easily, right? So well-oiled dispositions just means, he's too easygoing. He takes the world easy, eat white, red, or brown, whichever can be got with the least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. So they're just giving you the summary of him here. It's really awful that he's not willing to work, and that sucks. But he's okay with that. He'd rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. And he usually goes with whatever is easiest for him. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment. But his wife kept continually dinning in his ears about idleness. So din is a old word for noise. So dinning is the action of being noisy in someone's face, or in this case, in his ears. Idleness is just you being still and not doing anything. So his wife continually dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on the family. So I don't really know if you would consider this nagging, since he literally goes out and does favors for strangers all day and doesn't work on his own farm. But basically, it's saying that she's nagging him about this. Morning, noon, and night, her tongue was incessantly going. Incessantly means that you never stop. And everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent. A torrent is like a flood of household eloquence. So in this case, eloquence usually means being like graceful. But when they say household eloquence here, they're talking about like how a person speaks. So basically, she's always talking to him. She's always talking to him about oh wait, I think my mic changed. Okay, here we go. Sorry. So his wife is always talking to him about what he should be doing. She's always nagging him. There's always words. Eloquence here just means being able to use your words. Rip had but one way of replying to all the lectures of the kind, and that by frequent use had grown into a habit. So since he has a routine for how he responds, basically they set into a weird routine where she fusses at him and he doesn't do he does the same thing in reply every time. They're about to tell us what it is. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces and to take to the outside of the house. So we're going to look up the word feign here, because I feel like that's probably the thing that's least understood here. We know what being provoked is, right? Provoking is when someone tries to like goad you or encourage you to do something or take an action, right? Here we go. I spelled definition wrong. But yeah, feign, it says pleased or willing under the circumstances. So being willing to do something. So here it says he was fain to draw off his forces and take to the outside of the house. So basically, she would fuss at him. He would look up and say nothing. She would fuss some more. And then he would just be happy to leave. He's like, well, if you're just going to keep talking, then I'm just going to leave. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog, Wolf. So they're telling you his, the thing that keeps him coming home. And adherent, when you adhere to something, it means someone who's stuck to you. So his dog is always there. Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye as the cause of his master's going so often astray. So he and his dog are very much alike, and his wife sometimes blames his dog for how Rip is. For a long while, he used to console himself. Console is to like soothe yourself when driven from home by frequenting, that means going off to a place often, a type of perpetual club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. All right, so let's break this down. We're getting more information now. So he's frequenting a club. So we all know what a club is a place where people gather. This is a club of the sages, though. A sage is someone who is wise. So it says, this is a club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village. So wise people go there. Philosophers are people who study like ways of life. So people who are smart and educated go there. And it says, but also other idle personages of the village. So also other people who just don't have anything to do. And then it tells you where they hold their sessions. It's on a bench in front of a small inn, and you know which inn it is because they have a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. So rubicund is a word that we don't see often at all. So we're going to take a moment to look that up. Hopefully I can spell definition correct this time. Here we go. Yes, so rubicund is especially of someone's face having a ruddy complexion, high colored. So basically ruddy, we can get that definition here, is having a red color. So it's someone whose face is very red. So they're saying that His Majesty George III has a red face, basically. Here they used to sit in the shade through a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip or telling endless sleepy stories about nothing. So these people just get together and talk all day. But it would have been worth any statesman's money to have heard the profound discussions which sometimes took place when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveler. So usually they're not talking about anything, but if a newspaper comes by or if they get some interesting information, apparently they have profound, that means like deep discussions. So imagine like hanging with your friends and just having a discussion about like what you think about life and how you feel and what's going on in the world and like how some things are great or how some things are messed up and the things that you wish that people will like change or get better at. They basically have those conversations while sitting in front of this inn. How solemnly, solemn means serious, in a sober, serious sort of way. They would listen to the contents as drawled out by Derek Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon their public events some months after they had taken place. All right, so we get another few pieces of information here. We get another person's name, Derek Von Bubble. He's a schoolmaster, so he teaches at the local school, and he's described as a dapper. That means like he looks very clean, very crispy, a clean, learned little man. So he is educated and he looks important. And it says he's not daunted. Daunted means like intimidated by the most gigantic word in the dictionary. So they're telling you how smart he is because there's not a single word that he would be intimidated by. We see sage again, that means wise, and how sagely they would deliberate. Deliberate means to like discuss deeply, and consider public events. So they just talk about things that happen all the time while they're there. And this is one of the guys who's at the head of the discussion. The opinions of this junto, and junto basically is just a fancy word for kind of like a group. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Let's see. But we're going to confirm it just by looking it up. Yep, so it says a political grouping or faction, especially in 17th or 18th century Britain, which is exactly the time period we're talking about here. So this is a political grouping. So groups of people who get together to talk about politics. So the opinions of this group of people discussing politics were completely controlled by Nicholas Vedder. He's a patriarch, so that means he's the head male of the village and landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to avoid the sun and keep in the shade of a large tree. So he owns the inn, but he doesn't work at it, so he can sit outside and talk with everyone all day. It says that he takes his seat from morning till night, so he's just there watching people come in and out. Only moving sufficiently means good enough, right? So he's just moving enough to avoid the sun. So that his neighbor could tell the hour by his movements as accurately as a sundial. So he only moves to get out of the way of the sun, and you can tell what time it is based on the position he's in. Because, you know, the sun is like brightest when it's directly overhead at noon, and then depending on how it's rising or how it's setting, the light will be different. So you can tell the time if you study him and how he moves, basically. That's how consistent he is at just being there in that chair all day. It is true he is rarely heard to speak, so he watches over them but doesn't say much. His adherents, however, remember that's word for companion, someone that sticks by you. For every great man has his adherents, perfectly understood him and knew how to gather his opinions. So he has friends that know him very well and they know how to get his thoughts on things. From even this stronghold, the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquility of the assemblage and call the members all to naught. So basically, he can't get any rest even while he's there. His wife will pull up on him while he's there and break everyone up, basically. It says, and call all the members to naught. So basically, she'll belittle them and call them nothing since they enable her husband to not do anything. And then it says, nor was that august personage, Nicholas Vetter himself, sacred from the daring tongue of this terrible virago, who charged him outright with encouraging her husband in habits of idleness. All right, so we have a few words to look up here. So August, we know that August is like a fall, like end of summer, early fall kind of month, right? So the definition of August is gonna be around that kind of image. We're gonna look it up just to be sure, because sometimes we see words that we like see in other places and we don't know how they get used, right? So August is respected and impressive, which makes sense. So August is a month that takes place at the end of summer. And at that point, we're in the second half of the year, right? We're past June, that's the 6 month mark. So we're heading towards fall. So once we're starting to get towards the end of the year, words that refer to those months are basically talking about how aged someone is. So like the first half of the year would be considered young, right? Because the beginning of the year, the beginning of life is youth. And as you get towards the end of the year, right, we're getting older. So if you have an August personage, it just means that you are old enough to be well respected. So that's how we get the definition of August there, by associating it with the time of the year and then taking a look at how that time of year will reflect on like a person's life if we were to use like 1 year as a metaphor for someone's life, right? If we go too far into like November and December, we're like on death's door if we're comparing it to someone's life, right? That's like the end of the year. But because August is like in fall, you're old enough to have experience and be respected, but not so old that you can't do anything. So August is like a perfect month to use for that kind of word. And then we also have virago. Virago, which probably just means something similar to like vitriol, or like basically just mean speech. But we're gonna ballpark it by looking it up. So yeah, it says a domineering, violent, or bad temper woman. Yep. So we're talking about basically just being mean. Yeah. So Nicholas Vetter, the head of this inn, isn't even safe from Rip's wife. And charging him just means, you're accusing someone of something, with encouraging her husband in habits of idleness. So she's willing to actually show up and say, you're helping my husband to be lazy. Why don't you encourage him to work? Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair. So like he can't even be safe at the inn with all his friends. And his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and the clamor of his wife was to stroll away into the woods. Here he would sometimes see himself at the foot of a tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, that's his dog, with whom he sympathized as a fellow sufferer in persecution. So fellow sufferer, basically his dog suffers with him because his wife also blames him, blames the dog. Poor Wolf, he would say, thy mistress leads the dog's life of it. But never mind, my lad, whilst I live, thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee. So basically what he's saying, his mistress, so like he's referring to his wife, leads the dog's life of it. So basically using the phrase a dog's life to say that like things are rough because his wife is so difficult. But never mind, my lad, whilst I live, thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee. So basically, he's like, I know that my wife is like this, and we're both suffering, basically, but I'll always be here. A wolf would wag his tail, look wistfully at his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, I verily believe he reciprocated the sentiment with all his heart. So the narrator, is saying, I am pretty sure this dog also feels bad for him. In a long ramble of the kind on a fine autumnal day. So ramble is when you go on talking on and on and on. And autumnal is just a descriptor for it being a fall autumn day. Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. So this time he ran off so far that he's actually up the mountain. Panting and fatigue, he threw himself late in the afternoon on a green knoll. So a knoll is kind of like a rock that has moss growing on it, or sometimes like a very soft hill. So like basically hills are like very high. So like a knoll would be something kind of like a low hill, something like that. It's an easy hill. It doesn't take a whole lot to get up it. Yep, and it says covered with mountain herbage. So it has to have like moss and grass on it. That crowned the brow of a precipice. So crowned, like when you have a crown on, there's something on top, right? So the grass is on the top of the knoll. And then it says the brow of a precipice. A precipice is an edge. So the knoll has an edge where you come up on the top of it, and there's grass over that edge. From an opening between the trees, he could overlook all the lower country for many a mile near the rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson, so that's the river, far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course, with the reflection of a purple cloud or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping on its grassy bosom, and at last losing itself in the blue highlands. So he's basically looking over this hill, this knoll, and just seeing what's below. So remember the knoll, the like slight hill is on the mountains though. So even though he's on like a very slight hill, he's still very high up. So he's looking out and they're just describing the river, him looking at the river, and just everything that he can see there. On the other side, he looked down into a deep mountain glen. And a glen is kind of like a small woodsy area. You make sure. All right, here we go. Glen definition. Yeah, a narrow valley. So he's on a hill. There's a small valley nearby. It's a part of the landscape. It says it's wild, lonely, and shagged. The bottom filled with fragments from the impending cliffs. So he's looking down into a valley, and the bottom of the valley, like a valley is like an area between two hills. And the bottom has it says fragments from the cliff, so we're talking like rock. And then it says it's scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time, Rip lay musing on this scene. So musing is like thinking, pondering. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. He saw that it would be dark long before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. So he pretty much sat there thinking all day until he knew he wouldn't get home until after dark. And he sighs at the idea of having to go home. It says encountering the terrors, right? So he doesn't want to go back home to see what else his wife is going to say. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hollowing. So it's basically someone like yelling, Rip Van Winkle, Rip Van Winkle. He looked around, but he could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight. Solitary means alone. So solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him, so he thought his imagination was messing with him, and turned again to descend. So he's turning again to go down when he heard the same cry ring through the evening air. So he's hearing someone calling his name, Rip Van Winkle. At the same time, Wolf bristled up his back. So the dog is showing signs of having heard something and giving a low growl. He skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. So apprehension is like anxiety. He looked anxiously in the same direction and perceived, that means he saw, a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks. So toil means work. We came across this word a little earlier. So a figure is working its way up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it to be some of the neighborhoods in need of his assistance, someone of the neighborhoods in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield to it. So he sees someone and he's like, why is someone all the way out here? But he thinks it might be one of his neighbors, so he goes to check it out. On near approach, and this is a big paragraph here, on near approach, he was more surprised at the singularity. Single means one. So singularity means he's surprised that there's only one guy, right? That there's not more people. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped around the waist. So this is like traditional fashion. So a jerkin is kind of like, think of like a traditional skirt, kind of like a kilt-ish sort of thing. But there are different versions of them. Not every culture has specifically like kilts. Yeah, so it's basically like a jacket tied around his waist. I think that that's a better description. And I mean, it's pretty much like a old-timey leather sort of thing. It says here often without sleeves, so it's like crazy. And it says it was worn, it's close to a sleeveless garment that's worn by the British Army. So yeah, this thing is strapped around his waist. It says several pairs of breeches. So breeches are like types of old pants. The outer one of ample volume. Ample means a lot, so very big in volume. Decorated with rows of buttons down the side and bunches at the knees. So he's in like really old traditional, like Dutch clothing. He bore on his shoulders a stout barrel that seemed full of liquid and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. So he's signaling that Rip should help him. Though rather shy and distrustful of this new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual alacrity. So alacrity is a word that we don't see very often. So we're gonna put it in and look it up as per usual. And you see what I mean by doing this over and over helps you to remember things. When you're looking up the same words over and over, your brain will look at the screen. Like alacrity is a word that we haven't seen so far. But as you look up words that are used over and over, it definitely will help jog your brain's memory. So here we have brisk and cheerful readiness. So he's ready to help and he's cheerful about it. So he complied with his usual alacrity because remember, that's what he was described to be as. He's a cheery guy that's kind. And mutually relieving each other, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. So they're describing what these two men are climbing up. So that man was coming up. Rip went down to help him with his barrel. And so now they're both going back up the way that Rip came. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard long, rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine, or rather cleft between lofty rocks towards which their rugged path conducted. So, rolling peals is like the description of a sound. So, like, think of that sort of low bass sound that you get from thunder. If thunder lasts a really long time, it just sort of feels like it's kind of rolling on and on. So that's the kind of sound they're describing. And it says that basically Rip thinks that it might come from a deep ravine. So that's like maybe an offshoot of the river. And it seems like they're headed towards one. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers that often take place in mountain heights, he proceeded. So it sounds weird to him, but he thinks it's just thunder. So he's like, whatever. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater. So an amphitheater, I mean, you can see the word theater there, right? So we have an idea of what an amphitheater is. But obviously, if we don't use the word theater now, they're related, but it's a specific type of theater, right? So an amphitheater, it says an open, circular, or oval building with a central space surrounded by tiers of seats for spectators. So think of like a sports arena. That's more or less what it kind of looks like. You can sort of see in the photos here. It's basically like an old small version of like a concert hall or an old stadium type of deal. So yes, they found like a small amphitheater surrounded by perpendicular precipices. So if something is perpendicular, it means that they cross at the base. So like think 90-degree angle, right? Anything like so if you form your hand shaped like an L, let's see if I can get mine on camera. So the area where like your finger goes straight up and meets your like your bottom finger here, that's what makes it perpendicular. It's when two straight lines meet at a specific point. Uh so that's what perpendicular is. So if something is going straight up and you want a line that's perpendicular to it, it would have to branch off the side where they would connect. These two lines, like my finger going up and then off to the side, is it being perpendicular. So when those lines intersect that way in kind of like an L shape, that's basically what something that's perpendicular is. Okay. Um and a precipice is like an edge. We'll look it up just to make sure, but basically a precipice is an edge. Let's see. I actually copied it. Why don't I paste it? Yeah, definition of precipices. Yep, a precipice is a very steep rock, or face or cliff. I'm sorry, especially a tall one. Yep. So we're talking cliff edges. So it says that the amphitheater, so this small stadium space, basically has kind of like L L shaped edges. So the way that the wall works on the outside is kind of like this going back and forth. So it's just sort of like these L shapes going all the way around in like a gate, forming kind of like a cliff. So it says, over the brinks of which impending trees shot out their branches, so that you only caught glimpses of the azure sky. Azure is a type of blue, and the bright evening cloud. So basically, there is a cliff, but remember they're on a mountain. So there's places that are higher up than where they are. So there's cliffs that are steep, but from those edges, trees are shot up. So you have like a cliff, right? And then you have trees that are coming up past the cliff. And their trees are so tall that you can only see some of the sky. So there's like you're in a space that's thick with trees here. And then the bright evening cloud. During the whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence, for though the former marveled greatly what could be the object carrying a barrel of liquor up this wild mountain, there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown that inspired awe and checked familiarity. So basically, Rip's quiet the entire time, because it's weird to be carrying up liquor on this mountain. Uh, but he doesn't know this person. He knows that he doesn't know him. The whole situation is strange. And also he doesn't know this location on the mountain either. He's never been to this amphitheater. So he's kind of like in awe, like surprised that this place even exists near where he lives. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot with the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at nine pins. So that's basically bowling. So people at the center of this like stadium space are bowling. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins with long knives in their belts, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guides. So they're talking about how they're dressed. Doublets, short doublets are like short coats. The jerkins are, the sleeveless jackets, um, hopefully not tied around their waist, but long knives in their belts, enormous breeches, so they have like really big poofy pants, and those are really weird to rip. uh, their visages too. So a visage is like a face. We can go ahead and look that up, but it is basically what your appearance is, what you look like. Oh, I see. It copied like the whole thing. Okay, so we're gonna look up visages definitions. And yeah, it's just a person's face with reference to the form and proportions of their face. So it's directly talking about the shapes of their faces. So their faces, or the shapes of them, too, were peculiar. One had a large head, a broad face, and small pickish eyes. The eyes of another seemed to consist entirely of nose and was surmounted by a white sugarloaf hat set off with a little red cocktails. So yeah, these people look weird. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of nose. So basically, this dude's nose was so big, it took up his whole face. And he's wearing a hat that has like red cocktails on them. So basically, like red feathers. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a lace doublet, broad belt and hanger, high crowned hat, and feather red stockings and red-heeled shoes with roses in them. They're just describing like what everyone looks like. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlor of Dominie van Schaik, the village parson, uh, and which had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. I personally do not remember what parson is, so I actually am going to look it up myself. I know for sure I have seen that word before. If I have to think, that would be the person who deals with money in a town, like a old, not quite like a treasurer, but something similar. But I might be wrong, so let's look it up and see. Oh, okay. This is a bit different. All right. So, beneficed member of the clergy. So the clergy is like the church. So, yeah, it says a person is an ordained Christian person responsible for a small area. Okay. Oh, I was thinking of a purser. A purser is someone that deals with money. Okay, so yes, a parson is a person who is responsible for a small area that's like owned by a church, so a small parish, which is like a religious building. There's usually a church in a parish, but the parish is not fully just the church on its own. Okay. So basically, the group reminded him of figures from an old Flemish painting. In the parlor is like the living room, the hangout room of the village parson. So of one of the religious people in the village. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that these folks were evidently, that means obviously, amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest faces, the most mysterious silence, and were, withal, the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. So basically, they're having fun, but they all look serious and sad. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. So imagine playing, uh, going bowling, right? Going bowling with friends, and everyone's serious, frowny faces the whole time, just rolling, getting strikes and everything. No one says any uh real words. No one's being excited. Everyone's just frowning. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play. So desisted just means that they stopped. If you've ever heard of like a uh desist and deceased, So desist means to stop. So they stopped playing and stared at him with such a fixed statue-like gaze and strange, uncouth, lackluster countenances. So uncouth just means like uncivilized, so not polite, without etiquette. And then lackluster countenance. Lackluster means, not exciting, boring. Countenance is like how you carry yourself. So how you address someone, what it's almost like how people can perceive how you carry yourself. It's basically how you carry yourself. So your countenance is like how you carry yourself, what someone can read off of you. So uh impolite, lackluster, um, kind of like attitudes almost. That his heart turned within him and his knees smote together. So Rip is very intimidated by all of their faces and the way that they're presenting themselves. His companion now emptied the contents of the barrel into large flagons. A flagon is like a type of mug. Let's see if we can find a photo if we were to look it up. Let's see, flagon definition. Hopefully we'll get a photo. Yeah, there we go. Flagon is a large leather, metal, glass, plastic, or ceramic vessel. And I mean, like the simplest definition we have here, a large container in which a drink is served with a handle and a spout. So think of like a pitcher. It's kind of like a mixture between like a mug and a pitcher, because flagons are usually not very big. Like you can see all these sizes. None of these are like big gallon type of things, but it is a bigger container that you put liquid in to pour into smaller glasses. So he poured the contents of the barrel into large flagons and made signs for him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They quaffed the drink in profound silence. So this we can get from context clues. If they quaffed the drink, it means they're consuming the drink, right? They are drinking, and then return to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage which he had found much the flavor of excellent Hollands. So while people weren't looking at him, he snuck a drink. And he became less anxious after a while, enough that he was able to sneak a drink. He was naturally a thirsty soul because they had just carried the barrel, right? And soon tempted to repeat the draught. So a draught is like a long drink. So he was thirsty from all the work he had done carrying the barrel, and he was tempted to basically take another long drink. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered. His eyes swam in his head. His head gradually declined, and he fell into a big sleep. So basically, he got addicted to the taste. It says one taste provoked another. So he was like tempted to have more and more and more. So he pretty much drank until he fell asleep. It says, on waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. So he's back to where he was at the top of that like small slope. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep, so he can remember seeing the old men and the weird faces, the strange man with the barrel of liquid, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woe-begone party at the nine pins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? So he gets up, he remembers everything that happens, and he's like, dang, my wife's gonna yell at me again. What am I gonna tell her? What am I gonna tell her? He looked around for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, so in place of his gun, he found an old firelock laying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. So basically, he looked to find his gun, but instead of it being there, he found like a really old gun that was rusted next to him. The lock falling off, he can't even use it. It says he now suspected that the grave roisters of the mountains had put a trick upon him and had robbed him of his gun while he slept. Wolf too had disappeared, but he might have strayed away after a squirrel or a partridge. He whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. So things are already weird. He just woke up. He doesn't know where his gun is. They traded it for something like really old and rusty. He can't find his dog, so he's like, dang, what is going on? He determined to revisit the scene of last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and his gun. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting in his usual activity. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Rip, and if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of the rheumatism, I shall have a blessed time with Dame Van Winkle. So basically, he wanted to go back to the amphitheater to see if he could find them and ask them for his gun and his dog back. But because he had laid out on the slope on the mountain, his joints are stiff, and he's like, "Dang, rheumatism is kind of like an older word for arthritis." So he basically is like, if I end up with joint pain to the point where I definitely can't move and do anything, he says I'll have a blessed time with Dave Van Winkle. But he's being sarcastic here, right? He's just saying it'll be worse if I'm actually so hurt that I can't even like pretend to leave. She's gonna lay into me, right? With some difficulty, he got down into the glen. He found the gully of which he and his companion had ascended the previous evening. So the gully is basically like the slope upwards that they went up to. And it says, but to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock and filling the glen with babbling murmurs. So there's no cliff now, there's like a waterfall there. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through thickets of brush, sassafras, and witch hazel. So he still went up the edge anyway, the edge of the stream. And he is basically going through all of these different um, bushes, trees, and plants. And then it says he sometimes tripped up or entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils and tendrils from tree to tree and spread a kind of network in his path. So basically, this place, he went back to where he was before with the man in the casket of wine, and everything looks completely different. There's like a stream, there's trees, there's vines. He's like, none of this was here before. At length, he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater, but no traces of such an opening remained. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall, so there's just a cliff, there's no opening, over which the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of leathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forests. So the amphitheater is no longer there. Here, then, poor Rip was brought to a stand. He again called and whistled after his dog, and was only answered by the cawing of a flock of idle crows, sporting high in the air above a dry tree that overhung a sunny precipice. So he's calling for his dog. He's not getting any answer. There are some crows that are flying nearby, and it says, who, secure in their elevation, seem to look down at and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. So he's looking for his dog. He's really distraught. He went back to where he was before. He can't find anything. So he's like, dang, I guess I'll have to leave my dog behind and go home. He the rusty gun, he takes it with him, and he just sort of gives up. Remember that this is a man who's normally very cheerful, so the fact that he's so full of anxiety um, basically tells you a lot about the situation that he's in. Alrighty. So it says here, as he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country round. So he gets there, he sees nobody that he recognizes. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion to which he was accustomed, so they're all dressed differently, too. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. So they also are staring at him like he's weird. He's staring at them like they're weird. He doesn't recognize any of them. He's like, I literally live here. How do I not know any person who's here? Why are you guys dressed differently from yesterday? The constant recurrence of this gesture, so recurrence means to happen again, induced Rip involuntarily to do the same when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. So he hasn't seen himself this whole time. They're looking at him, And the men with beards are like stroking their chins. They're like, "Who are you?" So he goes to do the same thing because he's mirroring them, right? He's like, and then realizes his beard is a foot long, so like 12 inches. It's a long beard. How did that happen? Right? So we got weird stuff happening. He woke up. The amphitheater's not where he thought it was. He's got an old gun next to him. His dog isn't there anymore. So we've got weird stuff happening. He goes to the village. No one recognizes him. He doesn't recognize them. His beard is really long, right? So we're getting clues as to like what is happening, right? Try to think about what these things mean. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing to his gray beard. The dogs, too, not one of which he recognized for an old acquaintance, barked at him as he passed. So usually dogs don't bark at him. Usually the children are very nice to him, right? We read about that earlier. So things are very different from how they usually are. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. So the city itself is bigger and there's more people in it. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been familiar haunts had disappeared. So, familiar haunts are places that you used to go all the time. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. So to have misgivings means to not trust things, right? You don't want to trust what you're seeing. So his mind is now kind of like distrustful. It says he began to doubt whether he and the world around him were not bewitched. So he's like, something weird is going on. What is this? Surely this was his native village, which he had left but a day before, right? He's just like, I just left yesterday. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the Silver Hudson at a distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That flagon last night, thought he, has it addled my poor head? Has addled my poor head sadly. So he's just like, why don't I recognize anything besides these mountains? The land is the same. Why is the city different? So he's thinking there's something wrong with him at this point. It was with some difficulty that he found his way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay. The roof had fallen in, the windows shattered, and the doors off the hinges. A dog that looked like Wolf was skulking about it. Rip called him by name, but the cur snarled, showed his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind cut indeed. My very dog, sighed poor Rip, has forgotten me. So he found his way to his house. It says it was with difficulty. But the house is basically ran down. The no roof, no windows, no doors. And even though his dog definitely looked like Wolf, he snarled at him. So he's forgotten him. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Dame Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. The desolateness overcame his connubial fears. So when something's desolate, it just means like it's run down and also deserted. Connubial, though, is a word that we don't see very often, so we're going to look it up. And notice, since we looked up a lot of other words before, we haven't had to pause to look up a word in quite some time. If you had to pause the video to look up some of the other words, that's totally okay. But in terms of the words that we've come across in the last few paragraphs, a lot of them have been ones we've looked up already. So connubial says relating to marriage or the relationship of a married couple. So they're talking about this house. It says it overcame all his connubial fears. So he's not worried about his wife anymore. He's worried about the house. He loudly called for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his own resort, his old resort, the village inn. So hasten means to move quickly. So he hurried and hastened, but it too was gone. A large, rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats. And over the door was painted the Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle. So this is a completely different inn place building than he used to hang out at before. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, There now was reeled a tall naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. So, uh, basically, instead of the tree, there's a flagpole, right? They're talking about a tall naked pole. So that's something we know in the modern age. It's a flagpole. So this man was kind of in during a time like before America was established as a country. So he was in the 1700s and early 1800s, right? Uh, the U.S. became um, its own independent country, kind of like at the end of the 1700s. But we didn't get our flag until like a bit later. So now we're seeing references to what would be like the future for Rip Van Winkle, right? So this is the biggest hint. We're kind of pulling it all together. He had that wine. He went to sleep. Now his beard is longer. His house is dilapidated. The village is different. It's obvious that time has passed, right? So we're getting like more and more clues about how much time would have passed. The stars and stripes, we recognize that, right? That's our American flag. For someone who, came up during a time where people were still like fighting to get independence from Britain, he wouldn't know this flag, right? So it says he recognized the sign, or on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George. But even this was singularly metamorphosed. So metamorphosed means changed. It's a fancy word for change, transformed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in hand instead of a scepter, and the head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters General Washington. So, um, he's seeing all the changes that have taken place. We're seeing the difference between what he's used to seeing and what he's seeing now. They're giving us descriptions so that we can go back and like compare to what the building looked like before. Remember that this said the Union Hotel, right? So not only are we in the future, but the Union is something that happened during the Civil War, right? So we're not just a little bit in the future of the country. We're a lot in the future, at least for Rip. There was, as usual, a crowd of thick folk about the door, but none of that Rip that recollected. So recollected is to remember. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it. Disputatious. So this has the root word dispute. Dispute means to fight or argue. So basically, everyone's really aggressive and they're argumentative. Um, instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquility. So instead of things being easygoing discussion, everybody's like ready to fight. He looked in vain for the sage Nicholas Vedder, with his broad face, or Van Brummel, the schoolmaster, doling forth the contents of an ancient newspaper. So doling means to pass out. So he's passing out information in this case. He's looking for the people he used to know. In place of these, a lean, bilious looking fellow, and we'll look up bilious. Let's go ahead and do it. Um, bilious, affected or associated with nausea or vomiting. So basically, a very bad, I think it's probably the second one, spiteful or bad tempered. So a lean, bilious, less bad tempered looking fellow with his pockets full of handbills, so he's got money, was haranguing. Haranguing is basically sort of like being loud, making lots of noise, but we'll look it up anyway. I might be wrong. You never know. Yeah, okay. So lecturing someone at length in an aggressive or critical manner. So you're basically being noisy and aggressive while you lecture someone. So this man vehemently, so that means enthusiastically, about the rights of citizen elections, members of Congress, liberty, Bunker's Hill, hearers of 76 and other words, which were a perfect Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. So Van Winkle is from uh, a more peaceful time. So these are references that we, the readers, are supposed to get. Citizens' elections. So elections started after the country was born, right? Members of Congress, that happened after the country, well, kind of before the country came together, but it was solidified after. Liberty, we know that was important in terms of us getting our independence. Bunker's Hill is a famous battle. Heroes of 76, right? So we saw the flag in the portrait that had George Washington. So we became independent and passed the Declaration of Independence in this country in 1776. So these are references to all things that happened in the years leading up to that. But for Van Winkle, Rip doesn't know any of this stuff. So these are references that he wouldn't understand at all. The appearance of Rip, with his long grizzled beard, his rusty fowling piece, his uncouth dress, and the army of women and children at his heels, soon attracted the attention of the tavern politicians. So these used to be good things, but now they're bad because he's weird and he doesn't recognize anyone. He's a stranger and they don't know him. So he's easily recognizable now. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to foot with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him and, drawing him partly aside, inquired. So that's asking on which side he voted. So they're asking him who did he vote for? Rip stared in vacant stupidity. So he literally doesn't know what they're talking about. Uh, Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm and, rising on tiptoe, inquired in his ear whether he was federal or Democrat. So they're asking which side did you vote for? And Rip is like, what are y'all talking about? Rip is equally at a loss to comprehend the question when a knowing, self important old gentleman with a sharp cocked hat made his way through the crowd, putting them to the right and left with his elbows as he passed, and planting himself before Van Winkle with one arm akimbo, so that means like spread out, right? The other resting on his cane, with keen eyes and sharp hat penetrating, as if it were into his very soul, demanded in an austere tone what brought him to the election, and with a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in the village. So they're asking, you've got two people asking him, what side did you vote on? One person gives him a little more information, federal or Democrat, but Rip doesn't know what those are. And then the third person shows up and it's just like, what brought you here? And are you trying to cause a riot? You got all these people behind you. So we're close to the end of the story now. We're getting there. Alas, gentlemen, cried Rip, somewhat dismayed. I am a poor, quiet man, a native of this place, and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him. Now, he comes from a time when the colonies um were still under the king. So he's saying this now that everyone's kind of like heated and they care whether or not you're part of uh you're you're allied with the British or the colonists. So this was not the correct thing to say. Here a general shout burst from the bystanders. A Tory, a spy, a refugee, hustle him, away with him. So a Tory is basically uh it's not really the equivalent, but it's parallel to like the Republicans, but in Britain. So in Parliament, that's their government system in Britain. A Tory is someone who's like more conservatively leaning, and they're known for being more loyal to the crown, at least in the past. So they assume that he's supporting the crown, and I mean he is, but not in the way that they think. They think that he doesn't support like the freedom of the colonies for America, and that's not it at all. So it says it was with great difficulty that the self-important man in the cocked hat restored order. So everybody disrupted and had to be calmed down. And having assumed a tenfold austerity of brow, demanded again of the unknown culprit what he came there for and whom he was seeking. So it says austerity. Austerity is kind of like um seriousness. And we'll look it up just to make sure. Because I want you guys to be able to look up things you need. Sometimes you almost remember a word, but you're not sure. So yeah, sternness, yeah, or severity in manner or attitude. Yeah. So I said seriousness, but basically being severe. Um, being severe and being stern. So he had to be really stern and very serious to get everyone to, like calm down. So they're asking him what he came there for, who he's looking for. It says the poor man humbly assured him that he meant no harm, but merely came there in search of some neighbors who used to keep about the tavern. Well, who are they? Name them. Rip bethought himself a moment and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" So he actually asked. There was silence for a little while, when an old man replied in a thin, piping voice, "Nicholas Vedder? Why, he's dead and gone these 18 years. There was a wooden tombstone in the churchyard that used to tell all about him, but that's rotten and gone too. Where's Brom Dutcher? Oh, he went off to the army in the beginning of the war. I don't know. He never came back again. Where's Van Bummel, the schoolmaster? He went off to the wars too, was a great militia general, and is now in Congress." Rip's heart died away at hearing these sad changes in his home and his friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world. So he's asking about his friends. His friends have all taken part in the war. His friends have gone to the war and like not come back. So he's finding all of this out at once. Every answer puzzled him too, for treating of such enormous lapses in time and of matters of which he could not understand. War, Congress, Stony Point, he had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "Does nobody here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" exclaimed two or three. "Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree." Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. So basically, they say he's leaning against a tree. They point to a version of him. He's looking at himself going up the mountain. And it looks the same. It says apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. So now he's not sure if he's even himself, right? Because he sees himself going up a mountain. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether or not he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. "God knows," he exclaims at his wits' end. "I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but fell asleep on the mountain, and everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am." So this part is pretty obvious, right? He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what time he is. He doesn't know like what time he's in. He doesn't know what's going on. The bystanders began now to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about keeping the old fellow from doing mischief, at the very suggestion of which the self-important man with the cocked hat retired with some precipitation. So now they're nodding, they're winking at him. They don't know if he knows who he is. Um, and they said they're trying to stop him from doing mischief. So they think it's possible that he's here to like cause trouble. And the self-important man, the guy who's in charge, it says he cocked his hat. Um, he retired with some precipitation. So retired, means to rest. Precipitation is basically to contemplate or to think and consider things. I'm pretty sure, but we'll look it up just to make sure. Let's see. We need more than just precipitation from weather. Let's see. Yeah, it says the fact or quality of acting suddenly or rashly. Okay, so that's a bit different. Um, so basically, he's pulling back rashly. He doesn't really actually know what's going on. It says, at this critical moment, a fresh, comely woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the gray bearded man. She had a chubby child in her arms, frightened at his looks, and began to cry. "Hush, Rip," cried she. "Hush, you little fool. The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice, all awakened a train of recollections in his mind. So he sees this woman and the kid that she named Rip, and he is trying to recognize her, basically. She feels familiar. "What is your name, my good woman?" So Rip is asking this woman, who is she, especially since she has a baby that's named after him, right? "Judith Cardinier." And then it says, "What is your father's name?" Poor man, Rip Van Winkle was his name. But it's 20 years since he went away from home and has never been heard of since. His dog came home without him. I was then but a little girl. So it says here 20 years. So he's been asleep for 20 years, is basically what he's finding out. Rip had one more question to ask, but he put it with a faltering voice. Where's your mother? Oh, she too had died but a short time since. There was a drop of comfort, at least, in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. I am your father, cried he. Young Rip Van Winkle, once old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle? So he feels comforted by knowing that that's his daughter. That's her name. Uh, and it says, they all stood amazed until an old woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her brow, and peering under it, in his face a moment, exclaimed, Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Why, where have you been all these long years? So he was confused at first. Nobody knew who he was. But the woman had a baby named Rip, and since he had asked about Rip earlier, she came forward to see who he was. So now he's figured out that's his daughter, and he has a neighbor that also recognizes him. So it says Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 years had been to him but as one night. The neighbors stared when they heard it. Some were keen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks. So basically, some people don't believe him, right? So they're winking like, oh, sure, he means that, right? And the self important man in his cocked hat, who, when the alarm was over, had returned to the field, screwed down the corners of his mouth and shook his head, upon which there was a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage. So basically, the man in the cocked hat, the one who's important, was like, mm-mm. And everyone else kind of agrees that it's not believable. So it says, it was determined, however, so it was decided, to take the opinion of Peter Vanderdock, who was slowly advancing up the road. He was a descendant of the historian of that name, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the province. So they have an old man approaching who is a historian. It says Peter was the most ancient inhabitant of the village, well versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood. He recollected Rip at once, so he does remember Rip, and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner. He assured the company that it was in fact handed down to his ancestor, the historian, that the Catskill Mountains had always been inhabited by strange beings. So he basically says, yeah, there's crazy stuff in the mountains. It was affirmed that the great Hendrik Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and the country, kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years with his crew on the half moon. Being permitted in this way, permitted is like allowed, to revisit the scenes of his enterprise and keep a guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by his name. That his father had once seen them in their old Dutch dresses playing at the ninepins in the hollow of the mountain, and that he himself had heard one summer afternoon the sound of balls like distant peals of thunder. So basically, this old man confirms that there's a folk tale around um uh the events that happened to Rip in terms of finding these old like Dutch spirits. So he basically confirmed, yeah, there's weird stuff in the forest, there's weird spirits there. I remember this story, and he agrees. To make a long story short, the company broke up and returned to more important concerns of the election. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her. She had a snug, well furnished house and a stout, cheery farmer for a husband, whom Rip recollected for one of the urchins that used to climb upon his back. As to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself, seen leaning against the tree, he was employed to work on the farm, but evinced a hereditary disposition to attend to anything else but his business. So that basically his son was the same as him. So they have a Rip Van Winkle, but it's his son who grew up to be just like him. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, though all rather worse for the wear and tear of time, and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he soon grew into great favor. So even though he's old, he's not in the same condition as everyone else from all the war and stuff that's been going on. So he prefers to hang out with younger people. Um, and he became endeared to them, basically. He won them over. Having nothing to do at home and being arrived at that happy age where a man can be idle with impunity. So basically, he slept until he was so old that no one would talk to him or complain about not doing anything. He took his place once more on the bench at the inn door and was reverenced as one of the patriarchs of the village and a chronicle of the old times before the war. So he's basically a relic at this point. They're like, oh man, he lived before the war. It was some time before he could get into the regular track of gossip that could be made to comprehend or understand the strange events that had taken place during his torpor. So torpor is long sleep, you know. How that there had been a revolutionary war, that the country had thrown off the yoke of old England, and that instead of being a subject to His Majesty George III, was now a free citizen of the United States. So he's being caught up about history. Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of states and empires made but little impression on him. But there was one species of despotism under which he had long grown, and that was petticoat government. So basically, small government stuff, uh, small government stuff that basically um, is kind of like just for micromanaging people. That's his enemy. So it says, happily, that was at the end. He could go in and out whenever he pleased, without dreading the tyranny of Dame Van Winkle. Whenever her name was mentioned, however, he shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, and cast up his eyes, which might pass either for expression or resignation to his fate, or joy at his deliverance. So he thinks of his wife and sort of shakes his head, but they don't really tell you if he's glad that she's gone or not. It could be either one. He used to tell his story to every stranger that arrived at Mr. Doolittle's hotel. He was observed at first to vary on some points every time he told it, which was doubtless owing to him having so recently awaked. It at last settled down to precisely the tale I have related, and not a man, woman, or child in the neighborhood but knew it by heart. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it and insisted that Rip had been out of his head, and that this was one point on which he had always remained flighty. The old Dutch inhabitants, however, almost universally gave it full credit. Even to this day, they never hear a thunderstorm on a summer afternoon about the Catskill that they say Hendrik Hudson and his crew are at their game of ninepins. So the end of the story is basically it wraps up without any real like he doesn't go back in time or anything. He's in the city now. He's just an old man who is there. He learns about the things that are happening, the freedom of the US and things like that. That's pretty much it. I feel like this story is actually pretty straightforward once you know the vocabulary, you know. He's an old man who didn't like to work. His wife used to nag him a lot. He used to run away from her a lot. He used to try to talk with his friends and sometimes couldn't get peace there. He went and fell asleep after drinking a casket of wine and meeting some weird folks. And then he woke up 20 years later. So whenever you see references to people sleeping like Rip Van Winkle and stuff like that, they mean deep sleep in that way because he slept for 20 years. All right, so we finally got to the end of that. Hopefully that helped with understanding. And we are just going to take a look at some of the analysis here. So after you're done with your lesson activity, which I hope was a bit easier based on us going through, if you need a second, pause the video. Basically, what this wants you to do is it says here, cite strong and thorough textual evidence, right? So basically, they want you to quote things from the text to help answer the questions. You should be able to find those things since we just read the story together. Pause the video, fill this out, and then come back. We're just going to review it a little bit. This pretty much breaks down the most important points. Starting on slide 17. I think it's just 17 and 18. Yeah, it is. Alrighty. So it says here, the setting of the story Rip Van Winkle shows the effect of change in America after the revolution. That's exactly what it does. Rip was alive before, and he sees the changes after. He returns to the village 20 years later, and he's treated like a stranger and is initially distrusted. And the inn, where he spent so much time philosophizing, so like thinking about life with his friends, and it's now a crowd of people discussing politics. And Irving uses the comparison of this to show the difference between the divide difference, old and new America. This highlights how Rip's world has changed in his absence, and we kind of know that already. But it reveals Irving's perception on politics. So it basically, the way that he describes these people chatting about if someone voted federal or Democrat shows you how the writer himself felt about people who or might have felt about people who engaged in those sort of discussions. So whenever you're reading a story, you should always take time to think, why would this person write that? So Irving wrote about Rip Van Winkle in this way because he got to write about what he felt life was like before the Revolutionary War and then after the Revolutionary War. And then on 18, they give you a little more, like food for thought sort of thing. The story is an example of how romantics explored the value of admiration for nature. And yeah, there's a lot of paragraphs in this story that's just describing nature, right? That's what makes this romantic. I feel like we've been at it for a while, so it's easy to sort of forget how this is connected to the romantic era. But there's a lot of like awe for nature. It says here Rip does not enjoy the stresses of his life in the village and decides to stroll away into the woods. He experiences a life changing event when he leaves to go to the mountains. And there's a lot of theme of nature in romantic literature and in this story. We get lots of forest descriptions, hill descriptions, mountain descriptions, sky descriptions. There's a lot in this story to that. And this is part of what makes it a romantic story. Another thing that makes this a romantic story is that the story focuses on just one person, right? It focuses on Rip and it uses his personal thoughts to reflect on the nature that he sees, the issues that happen to people in the city. He's always been a very nature kind of guy. Like he goes off to the woods whenever he feels stressed about being in town and dealing with his wife. And when he comes back to the village, he has to have like a huge adjustment because now the entire village is basically about talking about things that are happening post the revolution. Um, and he has to figure out how to deal with that because he's not that kind of guy. It says the mountains are described as both beautiful and mysterious. They set the scene for Rip's experience of waking 20 years in the future. And that's absolutely true. Um, this is just a really nice example of kind of like the creativity, the imaginings that you find in romantic literature that's very different from like the cold logical stuff that we used to get in the Age of Reason before this. So we have like more imagination, more creativity, more like fancy and magic. This man slept for 20 years. That's physically impossible, right? But the story uses that to sort of deliver a message about how America was different before and after the revolution. And that is actually about it for this reading selection. These are the only two pages that really discuss this at length. I think the rest of this is a focus on language sort of thing. Yeah, it is. So I'm going to stop sharing. I know that this was a long video, but they gave you the whole story. This was not an excerpt. So I wanted to go through and make sure everyone understood what happened. It can help to take notes paragraph by paragraph of like summarizing what happens, like the most important points. So when you come back to your notes, you get like some lines that give you the summary of the story that might jog your memory for the mastery test. But okay, that's pretty much it for me. I'm not going to hold you any longer. I know this video was long already. So my name is Miss Amber. I am the English Curriculum Guide. Good luck with the rest of your English class, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.